Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the next session in today's MVP Days. My name is Andy Syrewicze, and we're here to talk about containers today, with the title and focus of the session being Containers on Windows Server by the IT Pro for the IT Pro. So let's go ahead and get started. So first off, let's talk about our agenda for this particular session. So first off, we'll do some introductions of myself and of the topic, and then we'll really get into the meat and potatoes of the session. What are containers? How to install Docker on Windows Server 2019? How to run containers once you've got it installed? And the thing about this session is I really wanted to talk about containers from an IT pro perspective, because historically containers have been more of a developer thing, right? And I mean, that's been the connotation. That's what people have thought about when they hear containers. And now it's becoming more accepted, and more IT pros are being asked to install, support, and use containers inside of their environments. And the use cases have become much more prevalent, I guess I would say, for the IT pro. It's not quite as nebulous and kind of murky. The use cases have become a lot more clear, and I'm going to be talking about some of those as we go through the session today. Now, the other thing about the session is I really wanted it to be kind of a 101 type of session. So this session is really designed for those IT pros that maybe they've dabbled in containers a little bit, maybe they've read up on it a little bit. They're not really sure where to go next or how to get started. Really, this session is designed to get you started with containers, and I'll also provide some links to some resources to take you a little bit further if you are interested after the session. So let's go ahead and start with our introductions. So again, my name is Andy Syrewicze. I'm a Microsoft MVP in the Cloud and Data Center Management competency. I'm a 5-year MVP, so I've been in the program for a while now. I'm also a VMware vExpert, and for my day job, I am a technical evangelist at Altera Software. So I've been in the industry for 16 plus years now. For 10 or 11 of those years, I was spent working for mid-sized MSPs. So I've touched a lot of different environments, a lot of different sizes of environments, seen a lot of different things in my travels. That's one of the nice things about working for an MSP. You run into a lot of different stuff. And, I've seen a lot of different use case and a lot of different applications for virtual machines and for containers as far as our talk today goes. My main focus has always been in virtualization, cloud services, the Microsoft server stack with an emphasis on Hyper-V and VMware, and more recently, containers, Docker, Kubernetes, and some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. I'm quite active on Twitter. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out and let me know. My Twitter handle is right there. Apologies, you'll have to spell the last name. And I'm quite active on the Altera blogs as well. So we have a blog for Hyper-V focused content, one for VMware focused content, and we also have a blog that's more geared specifically at MSPs. So some of the resources that I'll direct you to today is I actually have a series about containers that I've been writing out on our MSP blog. So while it has a little bit of a MSP focus, the information is still relevant and good for any IT pro. You don't have to work at an MSP to get anything out of these articles that I'm going to be linking, but just so you know, they are out on the MSP blog, and they will have a little bit of an MSP spin to them. So a little bit about the company I work for, Altera Software. We make backup software, and that backup software is trusted and used by 40,000 plus customers, 7,000 plus partners and MSPs worldwide. If you're interested in a little bit more about that product, it's altera.com/vm-backup for more information. So let's get into our topic for the day, containers. And I want to start with just a simple question. What is a container? That's probably the most common question that I get when I'm talking to folks about container or I'm introducing the topic, is just a simple, what is a container? Because it's kind of this, like I said earlier, it's kind of this murky thing that a lot of IT pros don't really know about or know what it is. So let's define what a container is first. So when I start answering that question, I always preface it with the answer of, it's kind of like a VM, kind of. So you can picture it like a VM when you're kind of envisioning a logical infrastructure layout. So over here on the right hand side of the screen, we've got containerized applications. And, if you've been looking at virtual machine diagrams for the last, 5-10 years, this is going to look very familiar. But it's still a little bit different. So we've got our infrastructure at the bottom. We've got a host operating system. In the case of our session here today, that's going to be Windows Server 2019. We've got the Docker engine on top of the host OS. So Docker is a container engine. That is the engine that's going to be managing and serving up the containers that I'll be showing you in the demos later today. And then on top of that, we've got the different applications. Now, a containerized application is an application that is paired with all of its prerequisites, and it's rolled up inside of what we call a container image. Now, container image is an important definition that you want to keep in mind. If you think back to how we've deployed virtual machines, and even before that, workstations and physical servers, we had this concept of a gold image, right? That image contained your operating system, and it contained all of the different bits and pieces needed to run the applications contained within. Now, when we're talking about a container, it's kind of the same concept, but the container only has a single workload inside of it and all of the prerequisites needed for that workload. So, if you've got a web app that you want to run inside of the container is going to contain a web server of some sort. It's also going to contain a container OS image, a very stripped down and super lean operating system image that's designed specifically for containerized workloads. The whole idea of a container is that the container holds only what it absolutely needs to run the workload inside of it. Now, in the Windows Server 2019 space, and it was like this in 2016 as well, we've got two different ways of running containers. We've got what's called a Windows container and a Hyper-V container. A Windows container is probably most similar to what the industry has known as containers for the last several years, and that it's kernel virtualization. So we are carving out a dedicated process space specifically for the containerized workload, and it shares the running kernel of the host operating system. So another important definition here is the idea of a container host. A container host is a server that has been set up and configured specifically to run containers. So you'll see throughout my presentation today, and as you read any literature on this subject, the idea of a container host. So like I said, going back to the concept of Windows containers and kernel virtualization, containers running in Windows container mode are going to share the running kernel of the container host that it's running on. So some people will look at that and they'll be like, well, hey, if it's sharing the kernel, isn't that potentially a security issue? And that's a valid question, and it's a question that Microsoft asked themselves as well, especially when they start looking at running containers inside of a public shared cloud infrastructure, aka Azure. So they knew they had to come up with a way to further isolate and protect containerized workloads, so they came up with the concept of Hyper-V containers. And when you start working through containers and using containers in the command line, you can tell Docker to spin up a container with Hyper-V isolation by passing the isolation parameter. So if you need a little bit more isolation for your container, or you're using a shared hosting environment, you're not really 100% sure that the environment is safe, you want a little bit more isolation on your container, you want to run it in Hyper-V container mode. When it comes to licensing, Windows containers, you can run as many of them as you want. When it comes to Hyper-V containers, they're treated like virtual machines from a licensing perspective. So if you're running Standard Edition Windows, you're going to get 2 of them. If you have Data Center Edition Windows, you can run as many Hyper-V containers as you want. That's another common question I get as well. And then finally, if you're going to get into more advanced deployments, more than we're talking about in this session today, you'll end up with multiple container hosts that are all clustered together, and you'll have some sort of container orchestrator in the mix. So an orchestrator is just a piece of software that's designed to run, manage, and configure multiple container hosts. Probably the most common two that you'll run into is Kubernetes. That's the big one. And to a lesser degree, Docker Swarm. You might hear about that one as well. So now we've talked a little bit about what a container is. Let's answer the question of why would I use a container? Because that's always the next question I get when I'm having this discussion. And as I've mentioned, they aren't just for devs anymore. There's a number of different reasons why you would go ahead and use a container. And the first one being density improvements. So you think about large-scale data centers and trying to fit as many workloads onto a piece of hardware as possible. You're going to get far more density with workload per piece of hardware than you would with virtual machines. So you think about virtual machines, and let's say you have a 10-host virtualization cluster in your data center, and you're running 50 virtual machines. How many of those virtual machines are running the same operating system? You think about all the similar workloads in there. If you could eliminate and pare down some of those, you would get more density for your hardware, right? And to kind of explain and showcase this a little bit, in Server 2019, Microsoft spent a lot of time improving on and optimizing their various operating system images for containers. So you see here, Nano Server on the right-hand side of the screen here, it's 94 megs in size. So if you have an application that you want to run and take advantage of a lot of the born in the cloud technologies, you could utilize the Nano Server container image to be the base of any custom container you build. Or moving on to the right, if you need a little bit more support, or you have like a legacy application that you want to run inside of a container, you start moving to the right here. So the server core, it has support for more applications. It's got full .NET framework support. But it's a little bit bigger, 1.4 gigs in size, a little bit larger, takes a little bit longer to deploy and stand up. But again, still at 1.4 gigs, that's not too bad compared to what Server Core used to be. And then, for more complex workloads, larger workloads that require more bits and pieces of the operating system, you've got a new Windows container image that Microsoft introduced in 2019 as well. That clocks in at 3.5 gigabytes in size. So utilizing some of these, you can see how you would get more density improvements. Again, these container images, they contain only what's absolutely needed to run your container. So you get more density per hardware, like I mentioned. A couple other advantages are, consistency. So when you deploy workloads inside of containers, you're automating a lot of the process. So therefore, you're removing a lot of the human components, a lot of the things that could create issues during your deployments. So not only you get more consistency, more predictability, but your deployments are much easier because of that. And you also have easier patch cycles. So just because of the nature of containers, let's say you've got a container with an application that's got version, 4.0 in it. And you've been running it, you've been using it in production for a while, everything's been fine. 4.1 comes out, and if you want to create a custom container for 4.1, you could roll it out, start it up, put it in production, and if something goes awry, if something goes wrong, you can easily roll back to that 4.0 because it's just a separate container. So a lot easier there, a lot quicker to recover from patching issues, and generally just makes your life easier, to be honest. So, and then my personal favorite thing about containers is the fact that containers can run pretty much anywhere. And I mean anywhere. And I mean, people would say that for virtual machines, but the thing with virtual machines is you're not going to run a Hyper-V VM on top of a VMware ESXi host and vice versa. A container will literally run anywhere. So I could spin up a container on my Windows 10 laptop. I could move it to my wife's Mac and run it there. I could spin it up into Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, or I could push it over to a Linux server and I could run it there. I could run it directly on a VMware ESXi host because they have a container engine now. I mean, you could literally run containers anywhere. That's one of their big advantages. So if you have a workload that you suspect, you need that flexibility where you're going to be moving it around a lot, definitely you want to look at containers for that flexibility. So then, we've talked about what is a container, why would I use a container. Then it always comes into this conversation of, okay, you've convinced me. Well, hopefully I've convinced you anyway. And the question then comes to, what kind of application is a good candidate for containerization? And really, I've broken this down into 3 different areas. I've broken it down into the easy choices, the murky choices, and stuff that just isn't quite there yet. So we'll start with the easy choices here, and that is stateless applications. Any application that doesn't, require that data be persistent. So a stateless application, like a simple web app, anything running on IIS or Apache, that type of stuff is really the low-hanging fruit. Very easy to move into a container, very easy to run into a container, and definitely look at those type of things when you're evaluating what to move first. Now, the things that get a little bit more murky, stateful applications. It used to be that running stateful applications or applications that had their own data set inside of a containers was something that was frowned upon, but fast forward to today, and it's more accepted because we have a lot of applications that they have a working data set, and people want to run them in the most efficient way possible. So the perfect example here is things like the Microsoft Message Queue or SQL Server. SQL Server is a perfect example of a application that's fully supported to run inside of a container. And what makes this possible here is we now have the ability to attach external storage to a running container. So if you have a workload that has, data like SQL, you can have the container start up. It attaches itself to some sort of external storage, in this case where your database would reside, and away you go. And then the things that just quite aren't there yet are things like infrastructure workloads, those core network roles like Active Directory, DNS. You're not going to run those kinds of things inside of a container. It's just not a valid use case. GUI applications. Containers are designed to be headless. You're not going to run anything that requires a GUI inside of a container. So that's just not quite there yet. So that's just some information for you to get started on, what to choose first when you're looking at candidates for containerization. So let's talk about installing the container image on a Windows Server 2019 box. So as I mentioned earlier, Docker is the container engine that we're going to use for this and is used in Windows Server 2019 to provide containers. And the EE here just means Enterprise Edition. And we're going to install the preview of the Enterprise Edition of Docker. And the reason we're doing that is in one of my demos here that I'm going to show you here in just a second, I actually spin up a Linux container on top of Windows Server 2019. And you need the preview version of Docker in order to do that. It's not something that's in the stable version yet, but I found that the preview edition is fairly robust. I haven't run into many issues with it. And installing this is very easy. It's not very hard at all. So the big thing is you got to make sure that the Hyper-V role is there and installed, because again, in case you want to spin up those Hyper-V isolated containers, you need that role there and available. If the container host is a VM, you definitely want to make sure you enable nested virtualization. So again, you can install the Hyper-V role on that VM. And if it's a VM, you need to enable MAC address spoofing in the advanced NIC settings of the virtual machine as well. That way your containerized workloads can talk out to the physical network. So if you're using a physical box as a container host, you're not going to have those same concerns. But most people I've run into, they're using virtual machines as container hosts. So one thing to keep in mind there. The actual installation is done by using the below commands here. So we're using NuGet, PowerShell get here inside of PowerShell. And the first thing we need to do is install a NuGet provider. And the provider is what we're going to use to actually install the preview version of Docker. So just 2 simple commands here. You can see in the screenshot here on the right-hand side what they look like. So you're going to do install -module Docker provider to install the necessary NuGet provider. And then you're going to install package Docker, and we're going to specify that NuGet provider. That's what we're going to use to pull down the image. And then required version preview. So that will make sure we get the preview edition of Docker. And as you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen in the picture, it's going to ask you a couple of times, hey, this looks like it's an untrusted repository. Are you sure you want to trust this? Just the usual verification features. And you're going to go ahead and select A, yes to all for both of these. So And once that's done, it shouldn't take very long, but Docker Enterprise Edition gets installed, and you can double check that it's running just by issuing a get service Docker, just to make sure that the Docker service is there and running on the container host. And you should be ready for the next section of our talk here, which is running containers on Windows Server 2019. And running containers is fairly simple. You use a couple of commands at the command line here. They're all centered around the Docker command as the primary one. And I want to run through a couple of different things here before we actually go down into the demo. Just a couple more of definitions I want to talk about, and a few different things that you need to be aware of when you start picking and choosing what containers that you want to run inside of your environment. Now, I mentioned container images a little bit earlier in the talk today. And again, a container image is kind of that master image that you're going to deploy containers from. And the thing about container images is they can come from a variety of places. I mean, you can custom build a container image. So I mentioned earlier kind of those three different container images that Microsoft has created for people to use for containers. So you could take one of those, or you could take a Linux instance of one of those and create a custom container image to deploy containers from. Or you can use what's called the Docker Hub. Now, the Docker Hub is a public repository. You can almost think of it as like GitHub, if you're familiar with GitHub. And the Docker Hub is just a repository of publicly available container images that people can pull and use in their own environments. And you would pull one of these container images from the Docker Hub simply by using the Docker pull commands. So by default, Docker will use the Docker Hub as a pull location. And in order to find a container that you want to pull, you can simply issue Docker search, which I'll show you here in a second. Once you have a container image, then you're going to use Docker run to actually deploy a container from that image and run it. So let's actually get to our demo here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to demo a Windows container. So I'm going to run a Windows container in what's called interactive mode, and that it will connect my running console to the container, and I can interact and run stuff in it just like any other operating system. And then what we'll do is we'll tell Docker to switch to Linux mode, and we'll run a Linux-based workload on top of Windows Server using that. And that'll be a little bit more of a quote-unquote production workload. And I laugh when I say that because, in the Syrewicze household, it's a production workload because that production workload is a Minecraft server. So just for fun, one of the first containers I ever spun up was to run a Minecraft server inside of a container. And it's worked as a pretty good demo to date, so that's what I'm going to be showing you today. So with that in mind, let's cut over to the demo. Okay, so I've got our demo environment open here, and so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run system info, so you can kind of see what type of system this is. You can see that we've got a Windows Server 2019 box. It's a evaluation version. And also down here you'll notice that I've got the Hyper-V role installed. So the Hyper-V role has been detected. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that, and let's start doing some stuff with Docker. So the first thing I want to show you with Docker is how to access the help. So docker -- help. We'll get you into the help information, and it's a great help system. I've been really happy with the help system here for the Docker command. A lot of great information. If you want to get version information, it's -- version. So you can see that, again, we're running the Enterprise Edition preview. That's preview 3. And then let's actually start doing some stuff with Docker here. So first thing we want to do is find a container image that we want to use. And I mentioned earlier that we could use the Docker Hub to actually pull container images from. So let's say I want to find a nano server image. I'm interested in just using a plain Jane simple nano server image. So let's do a search for nano server. By default, Docker will search the Docker Hub. And because of my resolution of my remote session here, it's it's a little bit difficult to read in some spots here, but we see we have a couple of different nano server images out here. If I want a little bit more information on a specific image, I can actually go out to the Docker Hub. So you'll see here that I'm actually out on the Docker Hub. One of the things I'm going to demo for you here in a second is a Minecraft server image. This is the Docker Hub page for the image that I'm going to use, and you'll see that there's all kinds of amazing information here about this particular container, how to use it, how to interact with it, you know. And very much like GitHub, which I mentioned earlier, you can come in here and you can see all the open issues that are currently pending for this particular container image. A lot of great information here on the Docker Hub as you start trying to find an image that you want to use. So definitely take advantage of that. All right, so let's come back to our demo environment here. And again, we were looking for nano server images earlier, but for the sake of time, I have actually already downloaded a nano server image. So I'm going to look at that by doing docker image ls for list. Shows me all the current container images that are on my machine. So you see I've got this Microsoft/nano server image out there. Let's go ahead and run this container image in interactive mode, which will connect me to the running container. And we'll also run it with Hyper-V isolation. So we're going to run this one as a Hyper-V container. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do docker run /it or -it for interactive. Then we're going to do -isolation Hyper-V. And then we're going to name the container. We're going to say nano server test. And then we actually have to tell docker run which container image to use to run the container. Nano server. And we hit enter, and it will actually spin up a version of this container image as a container called nano server test using Hyper-V isolation, and it will attach us to the console of that container here in just a second. So there, now you can see that we have been attached to the container, and I can navigate around it just like I would any other Windows server or any other Windows application. I can say host name. I'm going to see what the host name of the running machine is. It's given a randomly generated host name. I should be able to ping out. So you can see I can ping Google from inside of the container. And at this point, you know, I could install applications inside the container. I could do basically anything that I wanted to inside of the container. That, you know, the same type of stuff that I would do with a full operating system. So you've seen what it looks like to run a full container in Hyper-V isolation. Let's actually switch to Linux mode now, and we'll actually run a more complex workload here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch Docker to Linux container mode. Right now on Windows Server, Docker can't run Linux and Windows containers at the same time. You have to switch modes, and you do that by executing this particular command. You're basically just setting an environment variable, which I'm going to do so now, and then I'm going to restart the Docker service. So now that's taken care of, we should be able to run a Linux container. And we were going to run that Minecraft server inside of a container. So I'm going to do docker search Minecraft. And we see that the one I had been talking about is here at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that using docker pull it, I forget exactly what it was, itzg /Minecraft server. We're going to go ahead and let that pull. So as you can see, our container image has been downloaded and is ready to use. So let's go ahead and actually run that container to actually start up our Minecraft server. So I'm going to execute this longer command here, docker run. We're going to pass in a couple environment variables into the container. So you see that we are passing in a EULA flag here to accept the EULA. We're going to send in a couple of memory configuration flags here. And then this -p, what this does is it actually binds this container to the port 25565 on the container host. We're naming the container, and then we're specifying which container image to use. So you can see that we've started the container, and I can get a good look at the status of the container by doing docker container ls. And we can see that the container is up It's starting, and in a couple minutes it'll be all set for us to go ahead and take a look and see if it's working. So we'll give that just a few minutes to start up and make sure it's ready to go. All right, we've given that a few minutes to start up. Let's go ahead and launch the Minecraft client and see if we can connect to it. So let's go in here and add server, and we'll just keep the default server name, and we'll point it at the container host. So in my case, hit done. Well, the demo kind of worked. So the server's there and working, but it's an old version of Minecraft. So my Minecraft client is actually newer than the version of the server. So, well, it works. It's there. Just the container image needs to be updated with a newer version of Minecraft, and we'd be set to go. So, well, that you can see, actually running a production, workload inside of a container. And, maybe it's not a production workload for you or your organization, but here in the Syrewicze house, Minecraft is a very critical production workload. So with that, you can kind of, like I said, get an idea of how containers work, and hopefully this session has been helpful to you. And just to leave you with a couple of different links here, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. Feel free to hit me up on any of the Altero blogs, and go out there, start playing with containers, and take a look and see what they can do for you and your organization. Well, with that, I will leave you to get on to the next session of today's MVP Days virtual conference, and thanks for watching.